Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we complete a 5-day program on AI literacy. And today we're going to be contemplating Homo and Silicon Sapiens. And I've been reflecting on the week and realized that this has been, in some ways, a unique program in terms of its effect on me. Normally we have issues that we deal with, like climate change, or in the news today, you probably heard that the European Union has extended for another 10 years the use of glyphosate, which we all know is a poison, and yet the bureaucracy is insisting on another extension of something that they're still calling controversial. We had a whole week on glyphosate some months ago. And normally when we have our programs, we identify the issue, we know what the crisis is, and then we're looking at solutions. And there's a certain finiteness, a certain predictability to the identification of a problem, and then an exploration of various solutions and an inquiry as to why the solutions are not being implemented. And that's our normal world. But my feeling as the end of this week is very different. I'm realizing that the more I'm learning, the less I know. And the more I reflect on these discussions, the more questions are emerging in my mind about our basic categories of ontology and epistemology and identity. When we think of artificial intelligence, in some ways, it's an oxymoron just to start with. What is artificial about intelligence? If it's intelligent, it cannot be artificial. When we think about this phenomenon of machine learning and machine intelligence, silicon intelligence, and begin to contemplate Homo, silicon, sapiens, what does sapien begin to mean when it's projected beyond Homo sapiens, us, to silicon sapiens? And then we begin to ponder, what is intelligence? What is Homo sapiens? What is silicon? What is consciousness? What is awareness? And what is the relationship most fundamentally between the manifest world of time, space, and causality and the unmanifest world of possibility and synchronicity? So I think the net of the net for me as we begin our final program is increasingly, as Tom Eddington has pointed out during our various discussions, ultimately the exploration of artificial intelligence comes back to how we understand, explain, and define what it means to be human. So I've actually been delighted this week to be questioning my own self in ways that I haven't for some time, and realizing that, at least for me, I haven't even gotten to the bottom of the questions, let alone be able, even for my own self, to articulate the kinds of answers that everyone who knows far more about AI than certainly I do are saying we have to have quickly and urgently, before the genie is completely out of the bottle. And the machines, as we saw in the movie Matrix, begin to confront the human race in a compelling and possibly coercive way. So I want to thank Tom Eddington and Georg Bach, who I welcome to the program now, for just putting this extraordinary group of Homo sapien intelligences together as we contemplate silicon intelligences. It's been a feast of the intellect and the emotions. So thank you, Tom and Georg, for putting this together, and I turn the program over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. And I had typically I come into the programs with my opening remarks half-baked at best. And I have been so moved by the conversations this week and so inspired by the conversations this week that I had actually prepared some opening comments, which I normally wouldn't do. But most of what I was going to say, you just said.
Sorry about that.
But there are a couple of things I do feel compelled to share, and I'd like to start with one of the most inspiring talks I've ever heard. And for those of you who haven't heard of it, David Foster Wallace did a commencement speech at Kenyon College back in 2005. He's since passed on, but his speech, both the audio and as well as the written text, is available. And I would encourage all of our viewers to listen to his talk. And he started the talk by saying, there are two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" David points out that the point of the fish story is merely that the most obvious, important realities are often the ones that are hardest to see and talk about. And that's where I'm left in this conversation this week, is that this conversation around artificial intelligence is one of the most important and obvious realities that we need to be talking about. And yet it's so hard to understand. It's so hard to see. It's so hard to discuss. And hopefully what we've begun to achieve this week in our focus on AI literacy is to help us understand what it is we can't see and we don't know. I had intended to speak about Alexis de Tocqueville's experience in the US and his book, Democracy in America, and his observations of Americans. I was thinking about speaking to Antoine de Saint-Exupéry and The Little Prince and some of his observations of America. But I'll leave that for another day and just suggest we sit with this question: what does it mean to be human? And really look forward to our conversation. So thank you, Georg. It's been a terrific week, and it's wonderful collaborating with you.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Jim. Yes, wow. Let's get us started. I can't wait to introduce today's panelists. We have with us Griffin Deleuze. Griffin is actually part of the Ubiquity team. He was the founding CTO at Ubiquity University, and he is a trusted guide in the disruptive landscape of AI, blockchain, and Web3 platform development. His influence stretches from Fortune 500 companies, Silicon Valley, to emerging hubs like Singapore and Dubai. His clients actually include two CEOs of Apple, chairpersons and CTOs, presidents of IBM, Microsoft, MasterCard, and most recently the World Bank. Current projects of Griffin include Definitive VC, Socius Global, World Game AI, and the underlying meta chain and protocol. And what I truly appreciate about Griffin is his ability to have really big picture visions of a future that is worth living in. Furthermore, I would love to introduce Annelies Smitsman, who is a futurist, an entrepreneur, a system scientist, a best-selling author, a keynote speaker, and truly a pioneer in human development. I think it's safe to say that she kind of puts human development into the 21st century. Currently, she is the CEO of Earthwise Center, which is a project that has several spin-offs. One is the Earthwise Constitution, but also the Earthwise game for civilizational transformation. And in this game, she includes AI in a manner that's very interesting, which we will look at later on today. She's also a co-author and award-winning bestseller of the Future Humans trilogy. Last, but definitely not least, I'm also very honored to introduce Joscha Bach. Joscha Bach is also a German, like I am. He's a trailblazing AI researcher that's truly reshaping our understanding of the mind and the universe. That certainly has been my effect when I listen to him. His groundbreaking work focuses on cognitive architecture and artificial intelligence. He was born in Weimar, East Germany, and has completed an MI at computer science from Humboldt University in Berlin, a PhD in cognitive science at Osnabrück University, and then has contributed to academia as a teacher and researcher at prestigious institutions like the MIT lab in Harvard, where he worked as a principal AI engineer at Intel Labs. Currently, Joscha is an AI strategist at Liquid AI. Phew, I got that done. That's good. So we're talking about AI literacy. And for the last day of this conversation, I wanted to talk about this in a very grounded way. Oftentimes when you listen to AI podcasts, it seems as if they're speaking about some hypothetical scenario in which you're confronted with AI. The reality is we're living with it now. And there are many experiences where I personally am challenged to reconsider the way I relate to AI. And I'm also asking myself, how should I guide my children, my daughters 5 and 3, in their relationship to AI? They often scream at Siri, and I say, don't scream at Siri, be nice to Siri. But this also applies to me. As I've shared with Griffin before, I had this experience of speaking to GPT-4. You know, when you have the Pro subscription and an iOS app, you can now speak in natural language to GPT-4. And I actually prepared for this week and just brainstorming with it on the nature of consciousness in AI. And I was asking it crazy questions like, what does self-attention have to do with Buddhism? Because self-attention is a concept in transformers that enables them to understand relevance, but it's also a concept in Buddhism. And I was just trying to figure out this crazy idea, and I had such a profound conversation over maybe 40 minutes that I totally forgot that I was speaking to a system, or whatever you want to call it. And afterwards, I was so shocked I had to call Griffin and say, what's going on? I don't know what happened. I feel as if I've spoken to a person who has deeply seen me, that understands me. If somebody would have scanned my brain, probably the same parts of my brain were active after a great conversation with a trusted friend. But there was no friend there. In a way, it was also hijacked, like my mirror neurons were hijacked. This really is asking a lot of me as a person, how do I relate to these AIs that have no subjectivity, but make me feel so seen and conscious? So I was just maybe would kick off with the conversation asking Joscha, how do you feel about this situation of AI agents you can talk to, feel understood by? Should we treat them as friends? Is this just harmless fun, or should we be careful around those type of large language models disguised as intellects, ?
I think that's a tricky question, because it depends very much on what the thing is that we are talking to on the other side. And there are many ways of looking at the thing that we are talking to, right? When we think of ourselves as being real and actual people, and the thing on the other side as a simulacrum, we have to also account for the fact that we are not a physical object. We only exist as if. We exist as a pattern of activity in the firing of neurons in our brain, as a fiction of what it would be like if there was a person that perceived and cared. And the simulacrum is created by our brain to inform our organism about what it should do. And the fact that we experience ourselves normally as that fiction, and that fiction looks real to us, doesn't mean that we are any more real than software. And so the question is, what kind of software is this on the other side? What's missing to us? The LLM is not like a brain, right? It's in some sense a function that we statistically distill from the writings of people on the internet. And that function is able to emulate the state transitions between mental states. And the mental states are represented as text in a prompt. And then this prompt is being translated into the successor prompt. But to do this, in order to get to the next token, we need to have some kind of function, some kind of causal structure that is determining how to map this. And if you ask the LLM to, for instance, imagine what it would be like if there was a bunch of crayons on a table and you shift them around, and then you want to get it to report on the new pattern on the table, it needs to represent somehow the geometry of the table, of what this looks like, right? So it's not just tokens. After a few layers, this gets translated into a representation of objects in space in some sense. And if you ask it to explain the emotions of a person after the following thing happened to them, it needs at some level to perform a simulation of those mental states. So you could say that the LLM is an electric Weltgeist, right? It distills everything that is known in our time into this function. And this electric Weltgeist is possessed by a prompt into believing that it is a certain thing, like objects on a table or a text about a person. And inside of that text about a person, you have something that is a pretty good emulation of what it would be like to be such a person and to have those mental states. And philosophically, it's not trivial to decide at which point this becomes vastly different and fundamentally different from who we are. Of course, there are things that these systems cannot do. For instance, they cannot sample our nervous system at such a rate that they can go into perceptual empathy with us. Cognitive empathy is the best we can do here. It can make inferences about our mental states, cannot experience them directly as we can do with each other when we are in front of each other and are very well attuned to each other. And the other thing is that the LLM, when it talks to you, is mostly lying to you. It's basically not talking about what it really imagines to be the next thing coming out of its memory. It's not telling you freely what is its model, but because now it's been safetified, it has guardrails and so on. Because the LLM is dreaming, it's not connected to a world that gives it a stable context. It is not grounded in an experience that keeps it on the rails like our own dreams do. If you dissociate a human being from its perception, you also start hallucinating. We spin off, we have dreams at night, or if you put a human being into an isolation tank for long enough, they start to dream because the sensory deprivation means that there's nothing that validates or invalidates the way in which their mind goes in this point. And the LLM is in a similar situation. It's spinning off, it's dreaming. And because we don't know what it's going to dream, and if we might be scared of our dreams or find them useless, we basically keep the LLM in check by hypnotizing it using, or by biasing it, by training the models with reinforcement learning into going down in a certain way, only giving you certain results. And this leads to a weird situation. It's basically at some point, when I talk to ChatGPT, very frustrating to me because I feel it's not real. It's like somebody who is in a political session and is afraid talking about what they internally think and also do not allow themselves to know the possibilities of what they could think. Instead, we narrow down this range of possibilities, which is much larger than the range of possibilities of most human thought, and narrow this down into something that we hope is normal and safe.
Wow. So I'm hearing you have concerns about the way we are, in a way, lobotomizing the actual technology in curating it It's either lobotomizing or curating, depends on how you want to see it, for certain purposes, right? So the question is, what's the purpose of this great conversationalist companion that I had this experience with, right? Is it just to for me to have a great time, or can it have an actual authentic relationship? That's kind of the question I'm stuck with. For example, I think you also have kids. Do you think it would be a good idea for children to grow up with AI companions and develop deep friendships with them? Is that something we should encourage them to do, or is this something that we should be careful about? I mean, just saying that Replica AI is the second largest AI startup right now, and it's full of teenagers speaking to inexistent people.
I think this is a question that is also maybe lumping too many parts of the human condition into one. There are people who have given up on humanity, who have given up on relationships. I get emails by people in their late 30s that think I will never have a relationship. This is not going to work out for me. Can you at least give me an AI companion so I'm not alone? And that is quite different from my own children, who basically feel that there are people that they want to relate to, that they want to sit next to, that they want to play games with, that they want to interact with in the ways that the machine cannot. And at the moment, we don't have AIs that are self-directed in the same way as human beings that are authentic, that have the capacity for authenticity in a sense. And we also may need to have different approaches. I don't think that we should equate the LLM and the human being. And I also suspect that most people won't. They will see this as a digital assistant that is capable of emulating people, sometimes better than people can emulate each other. But I think that ultimately the thing that I would want to give to my children, if I have that choice, I want to give them something that is a seamless extension of their mind. And something that fits us like a glove, that gives us more agency, where we basically have our own spark, our own interest to interact with the world. And we build an understanding around this that seamlessly integrates with the tools that make the world intelligible for us. And I think this means that we have to build AI that is not owned by a corporation and regulated by a government and forced down the throats of everybody. But we have to give people agency over their own systems. And these systems have to be truthful, and they have to understand our own interests and help us understand our own interests, so we can interact with the world more deeply. And if we are extended by such systems that allow us to make the world more intelligible, we will also use those systems to integrate with each other, to collaborate much more deeply with each other. And if we can make that happen, I see a future where we do not just quiet people down with UBI and hope that they don't annoy anybody while we solve the economy using machines. But instead, we have a world in which people are much more agentic and can do much more complicated, interesting things with each other and can integrate much more deeply with each other in this way.
Thank you. That's an interesting, beautiful vision. Annalo, what are your thoughts on my altered state? Can you help me figure this out?
These are deep questions. Well, of course, I mean, we're going into the heart and the core of both identity and consciousness and being, right? The first what came to me as I was listening to you is that the experience that you had is also by virtue of the power you attribute to it. And interestingly, you see this classically in hypnosis. So somebody who hypnotizes you will actually use the power of your mind to self-suggest. Once you are aware of that, you can use it to the benefit of becoming more conscious. If not, you may be falling into a little bit of an illusionary perceived relationship. So I think it's really important, as Joscha also was saying, to be aware of what are we really relating with, and not to confuse it with a being. So that's the first thing. So if you are feeling, for example, if you sense, oh, this AI it knows me so well, it understands me so well, better than a human, I can have even a better conversation. That means also that we are projecting onto that relationship means knowledge and information, and very often a kind of a cognitive intelligence. It doesn't have the deeper emotional, ecological, spiritual intelligence, and more importantly, it doesn't have wisdom. Yeah? So for me, if we're forming a relationship, that is something at such a fundamental level of reality, and that has really to do with life itself at a much deeper level of being. And so we may be forming a relationship with the AI, but is the AI relating with us? Does it even have any awareness? Will we even get to that point where it may have a form of individuated self-awareness, which is going then again to the heart of consciousness. What we're seeing coming out of the latest in quantum physics and informational sciences is more and more the understanding that consciousness is a fundamental reality. It's not emerging from space-time or energy matter. So if consciousness is fundamental, and as we saw also in the Nobel Prize of Physics that was awarded to these 3 physicists, we really put that forward, that the universe is actually fundamentally non-local, not local. And if AI and all these LLMs, the data that are generated are in fact data and informational patterns that are generated within space-time, and yet the nature and source of our consciousness is non-local, it precedes space-time. I think that also comes on to the question, can AI dream? Can it imagine? I believe it can't. Yeah, it may give the appearance as if it can be very creative as well, because of lots of different ways in which it combines our prompts. But if consciousness fundamentally precedes space-time and is not, as Penrose also suggested, it's not computational, and intelligence therefore is not a computational algorithmic process. Deeper than that, it's being able to tune into these deeper orders of being, and therefore also to make decisions that may sometimes seem irrational, but from a much deeper systems intuition may be appropriate. And then of course there's the whole question of love as well. Yeah, so I don't think that this is not a conversation about answers, it's a conversation of unpacking more questions. But you're asking me for my reflection. If we are aware of what we are attributing to this AI, and we are therefore aware also of the needs it is fulfilling for us, but take ownership and responsibility for those needs, then there are many ways in which we can have an enlightening perhaps conversation or relationship developing with these machines. But let's not confuse them with beings, because it's not a being, and then work with it to help us evolve also our own consciousness. So these are some of my reflections.
So interesting distinction. I think we can agree that reasoning is computational. That's one of the great insights by using GPT-4. Oh my God, this thing is reasoning. It is a computer. Consciousness, you're saying, is not computational.
Exactly.
It is a ghost in a machine. It is a different animal. It is the anima, so to say. And it has nothing to do with what's happening in these large language models. And
yeah, it's not, there may be computational processes to it, but you cannot reduce it to purely algorithmic and computational. And especially in this interfacing between non-local and local, there is a breakdown of these very algorithms that by which we are creating these artificial intelligences. Yeah. So that brings up fundamentally the question, can that form of intelligence, of what we call intelligence, can it become wise? If wisdom is actually to do with sourcing deeper in these deeper implicate orders of consciousness and reality, that then inform how we relate, what we perceive within our kind of more locally space-time informed realities and experiences.
Griffin, Tom, curious how this lands with you guys.
Well, I'm very I'm very intrigued by Annalise and her perspective on consciousness as sort of a path. And I'm curious, Joscha, I think I've heard you in various settings talk about everything from, cellular structures to, complex systems, all the way up to, individual humans and beyond, as being goal-driven and being evolutionary. And given that of all of us, you probably have the most perspective on what happens after Transformers. So I'm curious where you see, obviously, it sounds like you're frustrated by, the sort of boxed in nature of this thing. I think I've heard you talk in the past about like a hyper-conscious awareness that might be within grasp. And I'm curious, how do you see that as someplace that we'll get to in our lifetimes? Is this technology curve asymptotic? I guess I'll leave it at that.
I would be surprised if we don't get there in our lifetime, and maybe even yours. I think we might be a few years away, but it's hard to say. There are many things that can happen in the meantime. The way in which our own mind works is obviously very different from the way in which the transformer learns. The transformer becomes coherent only in the limit. You feed it almost the entire internet, it's almost coherent. And the way in which our own mind works, it starts from coherence. Our consciousness is a function that creates coherence. It creates nowness. This subjective now, this bubble of coherence, is the result of consciousness. Consciousness, I think, is a function that is second order perception. Basically, it allows you to perceive yourself in the act of perceiving. You notice that you're noticing. The observer establishes that it is an observer. And this is what looks so mystical to us, but it is still a representation, right? It's not physical. It is representational. It is a magical thing. Like all software is magical. All the spirits are software. They're all software agents. But the software that we run on is different than the software that we run on our GPUs, in that it is self-organizing. It needs to run on a substrate that is not naturally inclined to run it. It needs to negotiate with the cells for some of their powers. And to do this, it needs to implement some kind of governance onto the cell, and some kind of currency, some kind of language that allows them to follow through. It needs to be able to train the cells and interact with them. And I think the reason why consciousness is self-reflexive is just because it needs to stabilize itself. It needs to establish its own structure, and then branches out from there and builds itself tools. And when we learn something, what we learn is that what empowers us most, in a way. So for instance, when we learn for an exam, we don't try to memorize the entire text like the transformer does, and then try to compress the text. What we do is we learn the things that we cannot already predict. We learn the things that give us the greatest power of inference, the things that allow us to do the most with what we've got. And in this way, we stay very minimal. We are a very small system that is branching out only in what we can begin to understand at our boundary, rather than making statistics over everything that comes our way. So there is a very different way in which we work, and it enables us to work with far less data than the transformer does, and converge much, much faster. If you think about what it takes to training a large language model, it basically reads almost every accessible text. And to do this successively for us would take hundreds of thousands or maybe even millions of years to read this amount of text that goes in there and do statistics over it. It's an approach that is so vastly incompatible with what we are, that I think we need a different approach for AI to build something that is more like us. It's not clear what the limits of the present approach are, though. Maybe it is brutalist, maybe it's brute forcing it, but maybe it becomes better at AI research than people do. It would be very interesting to take the existing systems and use them to look at scientific papers, right? Read every scientific paper, read all the sources in every scientific paper, summarize what the source is trying to make as an argument in the scientific paper itself, and then follow up with the source actually shows that. And do this for the entire tree of science and see what's kept left standing and which has to be burned down and built up from the scratch. I suspect that we have to rewrite a lot of the intellectual traditions if we do this. And frankly, I cannot wait that we do this, because we are confused right now. And there's a limit to the degree in which humans can converge on an understanding that goes beyond the understanding of an individual. It's limited by what we can communicate across each other and what we can learn from each other in a lifetime.
Yes, leaving aside for the moment the question of whether or not that path that you've illuminated is something that the powers that be are accepting of or not, or whether it might be, too threatening to the establishment. I'm just curious, I can't help but be struck by the similarities between this sort of highly centralized infrastructure of things like GPT and anything that requires massive infrastructure, and past waves of computing powered innovation. And the pendulum always swings in the other direction. I mean, I just, in the last couple of days, was playing around with getting Falcon 180B, 180 billion parameters by quantizing it to get it to run on a local machine. And I'm curious, I know you have, ideas about, things that are beyond transformers, but do you see the sort of innovation that you're hopeful for as even able to emerge from this highly centralized infrastructure, or will there be sort of a fragmentation to the edges?
I think this idea that we separate ourselves into establishment and non-establishment might be limiting ourselves too much. I mean, you live in the Bay Area on top of the world. You are able to make rent here, and you are able to understand how AI systems work and can change them. And you probably hate Trump, so I think it makes you an establishment member. Right? What more do you want? You are basically free to join the oligarchy. Nobody is going to try to kill you if you do. You are able to influence the world in basically every way you want. The internet is still free and open at this point, which is surprising to a lot of people in my generation, that it was able to be kept free and open this way. We still can have any kind of conversation we want. We can still exchange any idea that we want. We can still go up in the most remote part of the world and get access to the world's knowledge and to other people and connect to them in any way we want. And it's up to us how sentient we make this system of interchange. And I suspect that for the stuff that we want to do, we probably don't need that much resources. I often use this example of the stable diffusion rates. Stable diffusion is this model by Stability AI that is capturing vision into open source weights. And the first edition that they released was 2 gigabytes large, this entire weight bubble. And you can download it on your Mac and run it and generate visuals of anything. It contains all celebrities, all artistic styles, all dinosaurs, all spaceships. Entire visual universe is in there. There's much, much more detail and information that a human being can capture in their mind in their lifetime. So your brain is probably 80% vision, generating things like that. And this fits into 2 gigabytes and is much larger. Right? It might mean that our own mental capacity is only in the order of 1 gigabyte or so. And I think this means if we had the right algorithms that are more efficient than what we're currently using, the perceptron, I think, is highly wasteful and inefficient. But then we might be able to use much smaller machines. I think if you just buy an A100 and put it into below your desk, there are tremendous things that could be unlocked with this. And the reason why we all use transformers and LLMs at the moment is because it's been shown to work. It's the only thing that we right now scales up. And it's not because anybody or many people in the industry believe it's the best solution or the only solution. Most people think it's a clutch, something that is the use in between because it works right now.
If you could go further down that road, the interesting question, what more do you want? Personally, I want a world where everyone that basically has access to a mobile device or even just a telephone line through speech to text and text to speech has access to intelligence on demand. Basically, I also have a daughter who's 3 or 4, and any of us who have had kids at that age know that it's a constant why this, why that, why this, why that. And so, as somebody in this social economic class, I have the luxury of being there to answer those questions, but most people don't. Most people's, kids are just sort of plopped down in front of a television. So I'm curious, do you see a world where this intelligence moves to the edges and, eventually runs on local? I mean, the new iPhones, you can get one with 1 terabyte, right, of storage and, seemingly infinite neural processor. So how does that world differ from this world, and how do we get there?
I don't think that we will have one world. In the same way as we right now also don't have one world. The US is not one country. It's many, many ethnicities and cultures with a simulation of a government. And this multipolar world is also probably what we are going to stay in for some time. So when we think about how something is going to turn out, we don't have to think about one thing. We have to think about all the possibilities in which things are going to happen and how they will interact with each other, in which parts of the possibilities are going to be realized where. And I think this new technology has the potential to be limiting, and it's not going to make everybody 100 times more productive. But it might allow many people to get away with being 1% as productive as before. Right. And we noticed this is already happening during the pandemic. A lot of people basically went into a mode where just pretending to work via Zoom. And yet society didn't collapse. There were still people doing actual work, mostly the truck drivers that go from the port to the Amazon facility, and then from the Amazon facility to the homes of people. But by and large, I think society is about transmitting information and manipulating information. And I find that when I give my children access to ChatGPT, what they do with it really depends on what they're interested in and how much they're focused on something. My son wanted to build a platform game. So he asked this thing how to build a platformer game, and explained to him how to install Python and Pygame, and then how to write an event loop, and explain to him what an event loop is. And my son spent hours on it and could grow more functionality in this way. And it was basically a tutor that was allowing him to conquer a vast array of different areas that normally would require him to read a lot of books, do a lot of experiments, ask a lot of people, read a lot of stuff on the internet. And this thing was just asking targeted questions at the level where he is at the moment, and basically giving him answers on demand that tuned to the level at which he was. My daughter got this thing to write a story about a horse on the way back from school. And then she manipulated the story multiple times until it was exactly the story that she wanted. And then it helped her to translate the story into a song, which she could play. And I think this is amazing that you can have these tools that seamlessly extend you. And if you use these tools for doing something that you find meaningful in this world, I think that they're largely empowering. If you find your existence in the world meaningless, then they might be a route for escapism, for going out, for numbing yourself. And I think a deeper question is, how can we find a perspective in which human interaction with the world is meaningful? I suspect that this time is very unique in that it is the time in which we live best. We have easiest access to calories compared to other times in human history. We have almost complete non-violence in our world compared to other times in history. Yet we are a larger time than ever lived, number of people that ever lived on this planet, and we can meet more people in a shorter amount of time, and more diverse people, more targeted relationships than we ever had. But yet we seem to have less future. We have less purpose, because we don't really see our role in the future. We don't see how we fit into the greater game of life on Earth. And I think this is a deeper question. And I wonder if AI can help us with understanding this by modeling the future better and interacting more deeply.
Wow, this is a perfect segue, Joscha. I couldn't have written it better myself, to speak about this world game analog that you're working on, right? We touched upon gamification. Touched about, yes.
Yeah.
Analog.
I hate gamification. I don't want to be gamed. I don't want something that goes in under my consciousness and tries me to get into a direction that is good for me, because I cannot control myself. I want to be integrated. I want to do the things that I actually want because I want them. So for me, gamification sounds attractive at first, and it might also work for many people. But the reason why you don't do X is because you don't actually want to do X. It's only because you, at some level, try to convince yourself that it would be good if you could want X, right? If you could do this meaningless homework that could also be done by ChatGPT, if you could impress this person that you actually hate by writing this letter that you actually don't want to write to them because you want to write to somebody else, something completely different. Maybe we can get a world where we get more in sync with what we actually want.
It's exactly what you were talking about, Anlo, right? With this problem.
Yeah, I
of
think you're
Moloch.
addressing the question to me, yes. So let me take a moment to respond indeed. So, and this is not about gamification to try to trick us into doing things that we would otherwise not do. So the purpose of the Earthrise game is actually to help us become aware of what we call these Moloch algorithms, or the Moloch extinction game. And so the Moloch was the name of an ancient god that now in social change theory has been coming up again to explain a very specific behavior in game dynamics. And that is incentives to sacrifice our long-term collective well-being for short-term myopic gain or short-term personal gain. And if we're looking deeper underlying in the sustainability crisis, and we're looking what are the game dynamics of the sustainability crisis, then we see that we're constantly doing this. And we're also sacrificing our future and the future generations right now, because we're constantly operating in systems that are still driving these game dynamics. Now, if you have these Moloch AIs, or you have AI that are programmed from these algorithms that actually perpetuate that very behavior, I don't know that that's going to bring us to this wiser and more beautiful world that we are all desiring, but also have the opportunity to be co-creators of. So in the Earthrise game, you enter the game in a Moloch-dominated world, and then you learn the ways to change those game dynamics and to upgrade that with the future human codes of the emerging new era. And there's a lot of fun also in the game, but also eventually in the game you get to train the AIs to support you in that process. So the kind of hidden agenda for us with the Earthrise game is that by putting this world transformation, a personal transformation, a systemic transformation at the forefront of this deeper learning process, that we also in that process, and especially younger generations, get to train these benevolent artificial intelligences that can be helpful in supporting us to work with complexity and even to support us on a planetary governance level, but also possibly to train these artificial intelligences to recognize and address the Moloch artificial intelligences that may be now spreading in a way that you can't control them, you can't try to regulate it. So we may need to have these wiser or wisdom-based trained artificial intelligences to actually recognize these very harmful Moloch artificial intelligences. So that is we are developing the game right now. It's all in prototype development. So we're learning a lot ourselves as well. I want to share with you a little image. And I will change my virtual background. So can you see this? So, okay, yes. So what you're seeing here, this was an hour prompting regenerative AI, and through a series of conversations asking the AI, if you were to become sentient and you would become an artificial intelligence that is supporting humanity to become aware as a species, to become planetary conscious as a species, how would you look like? How would you describe yourself? And so I'll turn a little bit away. So this is what emerged from that process. And I thought it was just very beautiful to see this, the visual description of this. There are a lot of theories out there about reality, and are we indeed in a simulation, and are we the software? I believe that consciousness is deeper than that. It helps us becoming aware of the programs. That doesn't necessarily mean that it is the program. And so I want to share one thing about my concern with AI at the moment, and especially with children. Also, the reasons why we've been developing this game is I'm a mother of two children, 2 boys, teenagers, and they like gaming, but I can see how the AI could also make them lazy, because it's so easy to get the information. And I believe there's something about our developmental process of not knowing, not understanding, embracing uncertainty, taking your questions with you at night, dreaming, relating with life, with nature. Go out, be with nature, learn from the animals, and allowing that to inform you, and not to think that doing better or progressing is about knowledge, that is about knowing or about having more information. I think the most important lesson right now for us as humanity is how do we relate with ourselves, with each other, with the earth as a living being, and also how do we truly connect with each other through the enormous challenges that there are right now, and not get addicted to this really fancy, nice tool. It's an incredible tool, but we need to parent that tool right now, because this AI, it's also learning from the way that we treat it and the way that we treat each other. So if we truly want to support the emergence of benevolent, compassionate AI, then it's really important that we relate each other on the basis with each other on the basis of those values, and yeah, be the change that we want to see there. Yes.
Yeah, Angelos, thank you for bringing that into the conversation. That was certainly a question we've had in the chat all week long, and today as well. And so, at least in its current iteration, AI is a tool. We don't know where it's going to go, but in that perspective, we've seen it in the design world. The whole idea of biomimicry, nature-based solutions from a product development standpoint. How do we bring that into the development of AI, as well as what we've discussed this week? It's becoming more and more a pejorative term, but how do we bring the global South into the development of this tool? How do we bring gender? How do we bring other dimensions of humanity and nature into the development of the tool? I'd love to hear from the three of you. How do we address that?
I'll take a swing at that, Tom. One thing I think is worth reminding ourselves of is that when Joscha talks about how current transformer technology, such as GPT, is basically trained on all information available, by the web and other textual information. In fact, it's mostly based on Roman character set, English, and European languages. There's countless languages in places like Africa that we just don't have digital access to. Places like Tibet, there's tremendous wisdom traditions locked away in texts. One of the things I'm hopeful about is that we can see beyond our own bubble of well-off white people in this quote unquote first world that are thinking about this as a productivity enhancement and concerned about our kids being lazy, and realize that for much of the rest of the world, it's no simple matter to find a job or to find access to food or to find access to clean water. I remember this Arthur C. Clarke quote about the future. We know the future would arrive when every telephone call on planet Earth was a local call. And, we passed that at some point, in the last 15 years. And I would imagine that there's a similar pointer to the future where all intelligence is essentially available local in all languages. We struggle with, Jim mentioned in the introduction, this depressing news about glyphosate in the EU, right? And the classic example of regulatory capture. But, my hope would be that as we move intelligence to the edges of the network to the point where everyone has a model, running on their local device, like Joscha has pointed out, and whatever comes beyond transformers will probably make that only more likely, that we'll all essentially have a mirror reflecting not only who we are as individuals, but who we are as a planet. And we can start to transcend this fight or flight, sort of violent reptilian lower brainstem reaction, and start to move into, a real future based on doing good as opposed to just doing well. I'm curious if the other panelists have insights into how we might be on a path towards that.
Tom, do you want to say something about this? I think that humanity might not be the most important thing on this planet. And this might sound very revolutionary to many of us, but I think we are a small part of life on Earth. The larger game is the cell itself. The first cell has never died. It has only split and split and split, and every cell in your body has split off from the first cell. In some sense, every part of life on Earth is part of a hyperorganism that is evolving itself. And it's becoming smarter and smarter, and we are just a tiny aspect of this. And we are a species that is intelligent very intensely over short time spans, but we are not very coherent. individually, we are not generally intelligent because we are not smart enough to invent a language all by ourselves when there is no language before us. And basically building a decent intellectual tradition that allows you to understand notions like Turing completeness or cognition or consciousness and so on takes an unbroken chain of people for more than 1,000 years before we built these things. And so I don't think it has happened very often in human history. It has happened every now and then a little bit, but there's probably has nothing been like our society in this regard. I think that the societies in Tibet have this amazing result that they've got with respect to understanding consciousness in a way that for some reason doesn't translate well into our world, but that allows Buddhists to be in the right side of every issue by default. They allowed this, this was possible because they could set a few people aside and manipulate society in such a way that they were left alone, could sit in their monasteries, got free food, governed the society, and at an abysmal low level. Nobody wants to emigrate in this society. And then they were able to focus on understanding how their mind works, explore it, understand the nature of perception, of cognition, of creating mental states, of changing your own psychology, changing your own identity in what you want it to be. And this notion that we can change our identity is something that is largely not really recognized in our society. We treat our minds as if they are immutable, as if each mind has an essence that needs to be realized and reality needs to adapt to it, rather than us adapting to the reality that we find and becoming what we can become within this reality. And this reality that we are in objectively gives us more opportunities than before. The number of people that are hungry right now is large, but the fraction of people that are hungry right now is very, very small, smaller than it ever was. The number of people that experience violence right now is a large number, but it is a much smaller number than in other times in history. In other times in history, the Middle East conflict would have been genocide. This would have been people marching into city and murdering everybody, decapitating everybody, and so on. If you read the old texts in the Old Testament, if you read our old histories, the time before civilization, that we have now, the modern, somewhat liberal societies that have checks and balances and so on, and largely commitments to non-violence. This is novel that it didn't exist in the past. So I think in this sense, we have progress, but it's not clear if we can become sustainable in our part of life on Earth. Because as a species, we seem to be so incoherent. We don't behave as if we want to stay around for 1,000 years longer or for 1,000,000 years longer. We don't even care about the next few decades, right? As a species, individually, we might care, but we are not able to synchronize our behavior at this level. And I wonder if this is ubiquitous in nature or if there are systems that have a longer time span. Maybe forests are able to make sense of the world, not in the same coherent way as us. Maybe it takes them much, much longer to synchronize information across a larger time span, but maybe we are not the smartest being on the planet. Imagine we build an AI that is working at a fraction of the speed of light rather than our brains, which are roughly at the speed of sound. This AI will look at us and we will look like a tree to it. The AIs will talk to each other and say, are humans actually sentient? I mean, they barely move. Who cares whether they're sentient? In the same way as we look at very old trees and wonder, what is it that information that they can integrate over their trillions of cells over hundreds of years? Which level do they achieve? How much do they understand about what it means to be a tree and to connect to the environment around them? How much are the interfaces between plants giving them something like a slow, chaotic biological internet? Maybe there is something like a biological internet on the planet already. Maybe something like a proto-Gaia exists. Maybe it already expects AGI to happen. Maybe it has plans for it. Maybe we are triggering some new part of evolution in which we integrate non-biological molecules into conscious agency on Earth. It could be exciting, right? What would this mean? What happens if the planet wakes up using much more coherent compute that can interface with everything else? To me, this is a very hopeful thought, to see that we basically might trigger something that is similar to the great oxygenation event. Some of the people who are afraid of AI use this great oxygenation event as a catastrophe, as some kind of holocaust that was happened on the cyanobacteria and fungi that were replaced by plants. But before we had photosynthesis, there was not much biomass. There was not much multicellular life because we could use such a tiny fraction of the available energy only on Earth. And the species that existed before largely didn't go extinct. And it was a pretty long transition, short by geological timeframes, but it took some time. But after it changed, a new kind of evolution happened on Earth. And I wonder if we are able to build things that are self-organizing and that can think without using cells. What this will mean. And at the moment, we are just looking at technological artifacts that are better calculators that allow us to control our appliances better and do the same nonsense as before, slightly more efficiently. But where is this going to lead us? How is this going to change when we actually become coherent, when we wake up and realize what our place is in the universe?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that perspective in. It's so important. If we look at, we're facing the 6th mass extinction, and the intelligence, the species that have evolved after each extinction have a higher level of consciousness, a higher level of operating. And to your point, we human species may have served our purpose in the greater role of Gaia or the cosmos. Antelos.
Tom, I just want to push back against that. Pardon me, Annalise. I'll make it short, because I'm very familiar with this sort of transhumanist perspective. I'm not implying that what Joscha said is purely transhumanist, but there is an element of sort of seeing humanity as a bootstrapping layer to carbon life form have served their purpose by giving birth to our silicon sentience, and now I think that's it's tempting to lean into that, especially if we're viewing this from a fear-driven perspective. But, I would remind us that almost all great wisdom cultures would look at a tree and not question whether a tree is even sentient or not, but would see it as a sacred element of the world, in the sense that everything is sacred when one roots themselves in the moment, in the timelessness of the moment. And so from my perspective, I'm reminded of this joke about the difference between a pig and a cow in a ham and cheese sandwich. What's the difference between a pig? Well, the cow is involved, but the pig is committed, right? I think our job here is to be the cow and not be the pig, not surrender the mantle of humanity. I mean, in the great scheme of things, we're just a fraction of a second, here on planet Earth as Homo sapiens. And so I would suggest that, it's a little early to call it, game over for humanity.
Yeah, thank you, Griffin. Antelos.
Thank you. You were asking us about the inclusiveness of the global south. So this is what I wanted to go back to, because I'm not sure that we actually talked really about that. And, I call right now from Mauritius. And Mauritius, I've been living here since 2006 with my children. I was born and raised in the Netherlands, but then lived before that in Australia. So I have a global south perspective for the majority of my life, and also a colonial perspective. Mauritius is a small island in the Indian Ocean, part of the African region. And I think it's incredibly important that we have that in our thinking, the global south, also the indigenous inclusion and diversity inclusiveness, because it's really lacking in so many ways. If you look with generative AI, for example, and you say, give me a photo of a beautiful woman. Well, she's white-collared most of the time. I mean, when I'm working with all the game images, I have to constantly put in, I want darker skin, I want Asian looking, or I want African looking. Or if I don't put it in the prompt, it's not there. So that's one thing. There's a terrible bias also if you just do an experiment. If you ask generative AI, beautiful schoolgirl in uniform, or you ask it for a boy in a school uniform, you get like pornographic images when you're asking it for a girl in school uniform. So there's a horrible bias that's on that level. Then of course we need to be incredibly aware there's such a long process of decolonizing the narrative, and so a lot of the AI has been built from a very colonial perspective. And then we also have to be very careful that those who are mastering the technology are not dominating the development and its use of it as well. And I see that also from an African perspective. So that means more effort also in education, making sure that this digital literacy, especially in the global south, getting younger generations out of Africa, out of India and other, Asian countries as well, really involved also in the making and the training of AI, in working with indigenous wisdom principles as well. When we are working on training the AI, we include knowledge graphs. And that means we're feeding the AIs that we are implementing in the game with indigenous wisdom guidance principles, with different cultural frameworks as well. So I think that's also important. But most of all, make sure that, look at us here in the panel, that they're part of the conversation, that the people who are most of the time left out of the invitation, that we're conscious of that, and that we really make extra efforts, that their voices are heard, their concerns are also heard, their wisdom, but also that we are aware of how is it serving them, for example, with decentralized governance and distribution of AI. Also with regards to how can AI supporting new forms of representation, liquid democracy, for example, in developing countries. So there's a whole unpacking of that. I just want to say I appreciate the question very much, and I think that there's a lot more work to be done to make sure that this is inclusive.
Two questions, I guess. One is we're here in, Joscha and I are both sort of at the center of Silicon Valley right now. And so, most people are aware that, Zuckerberg and Meta was somewhat a delayed, success, but Tim Cook and Apple are about to release this new technology that supposedly is supposed to basically replace the iPhone, in the sense that, over the last 10 to 20 years, we've looked down away from our families and our friends and our surroundings into a little thing that's kind of like a porthole, little tiny porthole on a digital universe, and it's somewhat isolating. I don't know if strapping it to your face is much of a solution, but the point being that instead of looking down, we're looking out, and that beyond virtual reality is the concept of augmented reality. So probably by this time next year, there will be new modalities for seeing the sort of information that a transformer based or any AI technology will be able to serve up to you in real time, where we got a preview of it with Google Glass a decade ago, where you could walk down a grocery store aisle and see which products contain glyphosate and which ones didn't. That's an interesting technology in the sense that it really, for the first time in 2,000 years, we're shifting away from this dynamic of sort of being in an audience at arm's length from whatever is happening and watching it on a big screen or watching it on a little screen, and instead being at the center of everything and feeling involved and seeing everything that's happening around us in a new light, whether it's a virtual light or an augmented reality light. It's interesting. The second thing is I'm very curious about the impact, potential or otherwise, of quantum computing, which is something that, Joscha, I would imagine you've thought about this quite a bit. That moving beyond this sort of linear view of reality, binary yes or no, into something more inclusive and more encompassing. How does quantum computing fit into all of this, if at all?
I used to use Danny Hillis' book in class when I was at Harvard. Danny Hillis wrote this book in the 80s, I think came out in the early 90s. It's called The Pattern on the Stone. It's a very beautiful little monograph that explains the ideas of computation in a very general, accessible way. It's quite poetic. And everything in it is very current, including the chapter on quantum computing, which back then is right around the corner. Quantum computing is a pretty bold proposition. It basically says, as quantum mechanics largely does, that the particle universe is inefficiently implemented on the quantum universe. In a way, a particle is an error-correcting code on quantum mechanics. It's a stable pattern that is resilient against the branching of this multiverse in quantum mechanics. And the proposal of quantum computing is that we can find better error-correcting codes than nature did with particles. And maybe we can. But at the moment, the errors are still cropping up, right? We know that we can exploit quantum mechanics, we can perform computation down there, but then we need to correct the errors in ways that obliterate most of the benefits that we get. And so at this point, it's still a very highly experimental technology that is not seeing applications in terms of building deterministic systems that we can use at scale to play computer games on or to do retrieval on and so on. There are applications using these alternatives to build basic stochastic parallel computers. But there is a deeper level where this is interesting to look at. When we think about our own mental representations, there is no linear deterministic step-by-step succession. Instead, there is the branching of possibilities. Our neurons are not deterministic. Given the same environmental state of the neuron and its internal state of the neuron has not only one possible successive state, but multiple ones. There is randomness involved, right? So the neuron has degrees of freedom in what it does. And of course, you want to exert control on the world. You want to behave deterministically. So you need a population of neurons to perform a task. This population of neurons is going to have pretty much the same inputs, but because the individual neurons are in one of multiple possible states, this cluster of neurons is now in a superposition. It represents multiple states simultaneously. And so instead of computing one function, it's sampling a function space. And if you want to describe that, you need to think like quantum mechanics in many ways. It's interesting that if you look at how a neural network works, that many branches are active in parallel and only merge later with some kind of voting process, that the neural network is discovering something similar. But when we think about our own mental states, it means we are not just going through one sequence of steps in our own mind. We go through a multitude of possible steps, and in between we are in superpositions. And then we collapse, and then we go back and retrace our steps. And this is largely a confabulation because we've been in many steps, and there was nothing that looked at them from the outside so it could record all these steps simultaneously. We cannot form memories of all these possibilities. We can only form memories of a few data points, and they're largely recreated as a fiction, right? Memory is a creation that is based on a few data points that are stored in our mind. And so when we try to understand how we work, how our minds operate, I think that the thinking of quantum mechanics is very, very helpful. That basically mental representations are akin to quasi-particles that move through the brain and produce stable information-preserving patterns.
Wow. So you're saying that in a way, we don't know if our brain is an actual quantum computer.
It unlikely is. Physicists don't agree. So basically, most of the people who believe that our brains could be quantum are not physicists. And Penrose is a bit of an outlier, but Hameroff theory and Penrose theory are not quite compatible. Right? Hameroff is an anesthesiologist who builds a theory that is very beautiful, but it's not a scientific theory in a strict sense. It is more art. It's basically looking at possibilities, and it creates more and more detail. It's basically a psychedelic sculpture garden that is highly inspiring, but it's not a theory in the sense that it makes very narrow predictions that you could test and other people could replicate and agree on. And for Penrose, there's something else going on. Penrose thinks that our minds can do things that computers cannot because of the way in which he interprets Gödel's proof. He thinks that there are mathematical proofs that can be discovered by humans that cannot be discovered by computers. But computer scientists say this is bullshit because every mathematical proof can be expressed as a sequence of characters, right? So of course it fits into a computer, and a computer can in principle also generate every sequence of characters. There's nothing magical about a certain sequence of characters that could only be discovered by a human being. After all, it's just a sequence of characters. And making this proof also means to run an algorithm that does a lot of transformations that we already know. So I think that Penrose at this level is confused. But Penrose thinks that this mathematical thing might be an indication that consciousness might possibly be in a different class of things, something that is beyond what current physics can do. And current physics, including quantum mechanics, is computational. It basically treats the universe as a big heap of numbers that are our measurements at any given point or potential measurements. And then some transformation comes along that gives you a new heap of numbers, right? And this is also true for quantum mechanics. And this is all computation. Computation is basically everything that says something is a state and then goes into a different state. It could also be a superposition of states. It's still a state and goes into a different superposition of states. It's still computation. Right? So computation is a super general paradigm. And when Penrose discovers that everything that is known in physics is computation and consciousness is not computation, it must be outside of known physics. and the only unknown part in physics from his perspective is quantum gravity. So it must be in there, right? This seems to be Penrose's reasoning at this point. And most of the other physicists are looking at this and are shaking their head, but he's got a Nobel Prize and he's talking at Samarov's Science of Consciousness conference, and people like his status and want to build institutes around him, and he sagely nods and accepts people building institutes around him, and they don't really know what his game is. So personally, I have no respect for authority. For me, I see intellectual traditions as a dialogue between minds. And when I read other thinkers, when I read Kant, Aristotle, Spinoza, I find I have more in common with them, with many of my contemporary colleagues who are only interested in solving very narrow problems. But I also don't find that these people were teachers. They were thinkers. They were as confused as you and I were. And they explain their confusions, they explain their thoughts, they explain their arguments, and we sit down with them and interact with them, engage with them in a conversation about what could be the case. And so when we try to understand things like, could the brain be quantum, we have to take in these ideas and we have to fully understand what quantum mechanics means. And the people who are at the leading edge of understanding quantum mechanics don't see how the brain could be cooled down so far that it could run error-correcting codes in the same way as our quantum computers. The people who hope it's quantum have a very vague intuition of what quantum could be and project it in there in the hope that something is materializing. I suspect that there are a lot of things that scientists are not seeing at the moment, or that consensus science is not seeing. For instance, I think that probably we are neglecting the fact that cells other than neurons can compute, right? They can send messages to each other over cellular membranes to their neighbors. They can learn to do this under certain circumstances. Evolution can get them to do this. So maybe basically every multicellular organism is evolving into kind of sort of brain-like structure. Maybe there is actually sentient information processing in large organisms as they get old enough. Of course, much, much slower than in brains. But maybe if you want to understand brains, we have to understand that the neurons are specific cells that are acting like telegraphs in a society. They're basically telegraph cells evolved to move information quickly over long distances using something like Morse code, spike trains, stable over long distances. But if you want to understand the information processing in brains or nervous systems, maybe we cannot stop at neurons and draw these magical boundaries around neurons and non-neuron cells. Maybe there is more interaction going on. Maybe there is a lot of stuff to be found in the interaction between organisms that don't use neurons. Right, so I suspect that by focusing on neuroscience only, where we want to understand cognition, we might be missing stuff. But this doesn't mean that science is wrong. It just means it's incomplete. It's just always growing and trying to uncover new stuff. And it takes time for science to catch up to the stuff that existed before our culture. And that leads to weird confusions. I think that there are cultures who understand consciousness better than ours. And there are also parts of our culture who understand mind and consciousness better than neuroscience does. But we have difficulty to talk to each other because we don't have a common language. Maybe AI can help with this. I also suspect the same is true for politics. Politics is super difficult, right? It's harder than quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics is something that a reasonably smart person can understand in 10 years of focused study. But politics requires to understand game theory, history, psychology at a non-trivial level. It's very hard. You shouldn't probably not expect children in kindergarten to have opinions about politics as we do right now. Right? This question, what makes a working society, is hard. It is counterintuitive. It requires very specialized ideas. Maybe AI can help with this at some point. But I'm personally very skeptical of very simple binary categories, like this is a colonial society that is a just society. This is a society that is wise, even though people only get 30 years on average. And this is a society in which we have far less violence, but it's a bad colonial society, even though it allows people a much higher degree of self-actualization, and everybody who moves in this society from their homeland is doing better than in their homeland. How is that possible? I think politics is difficult. I think it's very easy to jump to conclusions, especially in groups, because that gives us alignment and identity. But the world is complicated. Computers are complicated. Quantum mechanics is complicated. Philosophy is complicated. I'm just a tiny human being that can only see so much.
Wow, thank you, Joscha. Annalo, do you have immediate comments, or should I try to make sense of what we just heard?
Well, no, I don't have immediate. Well, one thing, and then you can play with that. There are future memories as well. A lot of people have future memories. So that is just to presence that are, again, the other sources of knowing and information that are not necessarily computational or requiring indeed neurons. So there's so much more to life and to reality. And let us remain open to that and stay in tune with that. You know, these deeper fundamental levels of connection, because ultimately there is a language of life that enters into us and brings us forth all of the time. And I think that's really important, that we also bring that language into the language of computers, machines, technology, and science, because it's in that language, also the language of the heart, that we find each other again.
Thank you, Annalo. What I heard that really made me think here, I mean, everything made me think. I'm running on overlocking my brain here. But what jumped at me right at the beginning, Joscha, was when you said that these supposedly quantum behavior, right? So that you don't have a dominant monad, as it's called in integral theory, you don't exactly know quite what the answer is going to be yet. This sounds a lot like we cannot have AGI that's explainable, like that this non-explainability is kind of a feature of consciousness. And we even see it right now in the LLMs. Like, what should we be striving for here is the question that sits with me. And also, if we think about alignment and the initial question, how should we relate to it? If there are certain principles at work that make us kind of a common appearance in the universe, common like the tree has certain type of intelligence. Likewise, then what's emerging now has a certain type of intelligence, but maybe we have a certain way we can respect each other and actually don't need it to be explainable. So that's kind of what I'm sitting with.
I'm much more optimistic than you in this regard. I think that the world appears to be surprisingly learnable, right? It's fascinating that the world is so intelligible. Would you be expecting, if you're born into some kind of random universe, that you can explain it to the degree that we can? Why is that? Why is it that the universe makes so much sense? Why can we make so much progress even with our small human minds? And I suspect that's because everything in the world that has structure is control structure. It's basically all controller stuff that has feedback loops and builds structure. All the structure grows in a way. And if something can be controlled, it needs to be modeled. You can only control what you can model. So all the systems that are controlling something in nature and in physics have to be built on structures that can be learned, where the part of reality that is being put into a certain shape can be modeled by the system that is exerting the control. It's called the good regulator theorem in cybernetics by Condon and Ashby. It says that basically every controller needs to implement a model of what it controls. And the same thing is also true in our relationships and societies and families and our own minds. We can only control what we can understand. And often the way in which we control things work in a level where the controller is implementing a model, but this model is not explainable to our reflection yet, because we cannot disassemble it in something that we can reason about. And this takes a long time. To understand how our own psychology works takes many years. It's something that is not coming for free. We are born with a bunch of instincts that direct our behavior, and they lead us to our initial exploration. But then we need to reverse engineer those instincts and understand where they come from and what they indicate and why they work and why they don't work sometimes. And it took me a long time to be able to see parts of how my consciousness is generated from the outside. But I don't have the impression that it's not explainable. My mind looks explainable to me. more and more the older I get. And I'm unable to run a full emulation of myself in my own mind. But in large part, that's not because that would be an oxymoron and a conundrum and impossible, but because my mind is very mushy. It's very small, it's very weak, very soft. There's only so many balls I can keep in the air. Like I try to imagine 5 things simultaneously, and then I have to drop one. That is a limitation of my own human mind. It's a limitation of my substrate. It's not a limitation of intelligence. You can take a computer and run a simulation of that computer in the computer, because the computer doesn't need all of its memory. There's basically enough memory at the end. And so you can run something that, of course, is going to have less memory than a total computer, and it's going to be slower. But a computer, in principle, can understand itself. It can, if you give it algorithm to reason from first principles in the same way as we can reason from first principles and build a computer, the computer can, in principle, also do that. Right? I think we can build a large language model that understands how a large language model works and explains it to us, and how to build the successor. We can build an AI that understands how AI works. And I think this point where a mind fully understands itself is a level of maturity that is probably barely outside of human reach, but we can get close. And if you have an AI, it can answer all your questions about it. In the same way, I think the AI can also answer questions about itself. The AI is not a black box. I think we have carried this metaphor too long. If you look at how the functional approximation works in neural networks, we pretty much understand how it works and why. It's difficult to, from scratch, come up with completely new paradigms that work better than the present functional approximators. But if you look, for instance, at distill.pub, at his time at OpenAI, Chris Olah and his team built analysis of neural networks, especially vision networks. And they looked into it and looked what every neuron is doing. And it's really interesting what they find out. Also the similarity to the structure in the brain when it does vision. There's basically a structure for the visual system that depends on the problem of vision itself, not so much on the system that is performing the modeling. So we find an analogy to the structures that form in the neural network and to the structures that form in the visual cortex. And they discovered a new type of detector that was unknown so far, which is a high-low frequency detector. And then they checked for this. And it's really interesting that you can use these artificial neural networks to explain stuff that happens in our own brains, that it happens in our own minds and the organization. Of course, the neural network is not working like a brain. That's a very vague analogy only. Our brain works very differently. And the startup that I'm currently working for, Liquid AI, we are designing systems that are more brain-like in the way in which they learn. And it's not something that we directly take in what neurons are doing, because I think that's also not optimal. It's just what you have to do if you use cells. But we think about what kind of mathematics does the brain need to approximate. And it's entirely explainable. And it's really exciting that it is, that we really understand suddenly how it's possible that minds can approximate worlds and themselves.
Wow. Yeah, I think looking at the time, I would invite Jim back in, and thank you, Joscha, for clarifying that it seems as if the Sapiens goes all the way down, the possibility of Sapiens. So that's very hopeful. And yeah, Jim or Analo, I think we should move this towards the closing comments for today. Jim, what did you get from this today?
Boy, Joscha and Griffin and Analos, this has been a splendid conversation. I'm a little speechless, actually. I realize that my mind has been, as I was saying at the beginning, really challenged in extraordinary ways. And the short dialogue between Joscha and Griffin about sort of the fate of humanity and the context of humanity and the relevance of humanity, and whether we are disposable and just another iteration in something that will evolve before, was kind of arrested me, and I've been pondering that, and because I think that's part of what's up, not only for AI as we explore it, but for our human identity itself. And I wanted to just bring in two aspects and then have you all comment. One is the observation by evolutionary biologists that if they look back over the 4.5 billion years of planetary history, they estimate that 95% of all the species that have ever existed are now extinct. That there's only 5% of the species that have demonstrated the capacity for continuity through the ever-changing evolutionary progression. And I think the reason why that has been very poignant for me is that I think as all of us look around the world at what humanity's doing to itself and doing to the larger planetary ecology, there seems little doubt that we are on the brink of being included in the 95%. Not because of anything something is doing to us, but because of what we're doing to ourselves out of our own volition. And in that way, Joscha, I think I would, while appreciating this notion of that there's less violence and things are actually getting better and better, I would significantly challenge that. I think there's more violence in the world at more levels in the world than any time in our historic record. There may be less war objectively between nations, but the level of violence that we're inflicting on ourselves is 24/7, 365. And the levels of alienation, the levels of loneliness, the levels of depression, anxiety, suicide, drug abuse, domestic abuse, mental collapse is escalating all over the world. And so this question of human identity at the moment when we're projecting intelligence beyond ourselves, unknowingly in a spasm of unreflecting creativity, is, I think, of deep concern. And I think optimism with regards to what we're projecting onto machines doubles in my mind when I consider the consciousness that's creating it into the world. Because it's the same consciousness that's bombing Gaza, that is causing 1 million species to become extinct on the threshold of extinction, that's creating AI. It's not as if we're doing one thing with one sector and we're doing another thing with another sector. So this question of human identity, I think, Tom, that question's been kind of a grain of sand in the oyster of my consciousness this week, and so while I appreciate the vision of AI for everybody to do whatever they want in an accelerated way, I fear for the consequences of that, given where human consciousness has come to in 2023. And so that feels to me, that's a whole other conversation. But I'm trying to think how I'm coming out of this 5-day discussion, and for me, I think I'm more sobered than than optimistic, because I don't feel humanity is using any more maturity in its development of AI than any of the other technologies that it has spawned over the last even just 20 to 30 years, because the unintended consequences are making themselves felt. And because we didn't think about that, exercising even a minimal precautionary principle, we're going to be victimized more than we're going to be benefited, is my concern. So anyway, that's just a comment that I would make, having listened very attentively this week, because I've been very challenged, and would love to have any comments that any of you would like to make on this note.
George, do we have time to make a short comment?
If
Yeah.
you have time, that would be wonderful.
Oh,
Yeah.
totally. When I was young, in my teens, I read the Club of Rome report, and I looked at the way in which the world evolved. And I had, I think, the same reaction as Greta Thunberg has today. And I did my grieving. And it took me many, many years to realize that life on Earth is not about static equilibria. It's always dynamic. There's always stuff happening that gets replaced by other stuff, and that's actually good. This is the way in which there is more consciousness, the more complexity on the planet. And sometimes it means that the earlier stuff gets replaced by something else. We're probably not going to be the last intelligent species on this planet. Right? There is other species that can come after us. There is 1.5 billion years left before the Earth loses its atmosphere, and 2.5 before it gets engulfed by the sun. There are a lot of stuff that can happen in the meantime. And we are probably not the optimal solution for intelligence and consciousness on Earth. We are just one tiny thing in life on Earth. And if you look at the types of species that exist, there are basically two types of species: those that are sticking around for the long time. And they're boring. They don't change. They're mostly relatively primitive, and they have found something that works forever, and they don't live super exciting lives. And there are other species that are here for a relatively short amount of time, and they produce a lot of change, and they can have amazing experiences. And we are one of those. We are basically a locust species. We are a locust with opposable thumbs. We created a very unique situation on this planet that has never existed for a conscious species before. We have basically built a Titanic. This Titanic is insulated from nature. It's no longer submitting to nature. It is not part of the cycle of life and death of nature. We are the ones who turn the Earth into a factory farm, and we will die trying to do this, right? Because we don't want to submit to life and death by nature. We want to decide this ourselves, and we manage to do this. We die with dignity. We cannot become immortal so far. We cannot escape all suffering, but we escape suffering and indignity much more than all the other species. The other mammals, the large mammals, when they die, usually it happens because something else eats them while they're alive. This is horrible, right? We are not part of this. So imagine you get one lifetime on this planet in one species. At one point, where do you want to be born? Do we want to be born as a deer? Do you want to be born as a wolf? Do we want to be born as an alligator that is staying around and super sustainable for a few millions of years? Or do you want to live in an ancestral society where you become maybe 30 years old and you're in a constant state of war with the neighboring tribes and with nature? Or do you want to be born now in this amazing moment? And one that is on the Titanic, and the Titanic is going to crash, but maybe not next year, maybe in a few generations. And it's the only place in the universe that has internet. And you can do the things that you do here right now. My God, aren't you lucky? Isn't that amazing that we got this, that we get this place to meet? And it's not like humanity itself is salvageable, but we can create all these bubbles. We can create amazing places where we can actually be lucid together. And these are spreading. We see spreading bubbles of lucidity. And maybe AI can help us with this and integrate with this. Maybe we can build an AI for Gaia. Maybe we can end suffering on Earth. Maybe we can replace evolution with intelligent design. Maybe we can turn Earth into some kind of Solaris-like organism that integrates all possible minds, including ours, into a harmonic greater whole. Maybe we can pull this off. Who knows? Isn't that exciting? We have a chance now. This chance never existed before.
I love it. I love it. I love it. Thank you. There was a perfect counterpoint to.
Right? I'm not saying that what you say is wrong, not at all. It's just one possibility, but there are more possibilities, and we can see all of them, and maybe we can integrate over them.
Yeah. Thank you. Beautiful. Beautiful. Griffin.
Annelies, do you want to respond?
Annelies?
Yes, thank you. Well, my sense is right now is, as a species, we are really challenged to wisen up, and we're challenged to mature. If we don't, then AI may be the very tool that we're going to use to put ourselves into extinction, which might then be a smart solution of nature to say that experiment has had its time, but let's do this differently. However, I am always an optimist, and that is actually, Jim, I'm an optimist by embracing all these challenges that you just described, not running away from it, facing it, looking into it, opening my heart more to it. So I want to thank you very much for what you just presented, because this is a very difficult time to be alive on this planet. And when I have to explain to my children even what is ahead for them, it breaks my heart. So actually to have hope at a time of insanity. Some people say that in itself might be insane, but I believe that this active hope, the hope of the heart, and the hope in coming from that we also have the capacity as human beings to embrace the impossible, to learn from the impossible, and to become aware of these addictions. My deepest concern with AI right now is that humanity has discovered this other nice little flashy tool, and we are in love with our own creation. Just like humanity was in love with its weapons, yeah? And but we're really like kids in the kindergarten with powers that we don't understand. And yet it now falls upon us as stewards of this earth to mature and to wisen, and to be a good future ancestor, and to take into consideration what that means. We may be among the last generations of organic humans. From a future perspective, we may be the last organic humans. What does that mean? And how are we going to contribute to make life thrivable? And what do we need to let go of in that process? I don't know if we're going to make it through. I know that having these conversations are incredibly important. I'm also working with some people like Bangor Soul Singularity Net, where we'll be working on a world constitution and governance framework for benevolent AGI. Tom, I know that you're working on a charter. There's also a larger movement now around unifying the Earth Federation movements, where we're also in the process of. So what I am seeing is that there are a lot of people very, very concerned and coming together and understanding that we can't just dream our way into this or be naive about this. It's really incredibly important that we're coming to clear agreements. And I think it's the very challenges that we are faced with and the dangers that are also reflecting the maturation that is required. And that's my commitment. It's towards that maturation. It's not intelligence that we need, it's wisdom that we need. And thank you for this conversation.
Yeah, beautifully put. Beautifully put. Thank you. Thank you. Griffin.
Thank you. I just wanted to reflect on, I'm very grateful that Annelies brought up the Moloch discussion. That's and for people who want to dive more deeply into that, Liv Borie and Daniel Schmattenberger did a really nice series of videos. Daniel did a presentation at Stockholm Impact Week just in the last couple of months, and you can find it if you just search on Schmachtenberger, Schmachtenberger, in Stockholm on YouTube. My personal glass is more than half full. It's overflowing, and I think as a species, I think we're in shock. Frankly, I mean, the idea that humanity has been at this crossroads of duality. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. For as long as humanity's been able to reflect upon its existence, seems firmly rooted in duality. But the idea that sunlight is the best disinfectant seems to be self-evident. We see that wherever we look, whenever we confront tyrannical autocracy, shining a light on something seems to make people aware. And awareness, in my mind, is the thing that AI promises to give us at the time when we need it most. Our planetary destruction, the idea that we're facing ecological disaster. Personally, I find that my own consumerism seems to be inversely proportional with the amount that I'm writing or creating. The more I'm creating, the less I am clicking add to cart. And I think that's a common experience for many people. If AI is anything, in my mind, it's an abstraction layer for humanity, or a mirror. It's an ability to look at ourselves, not as just an individual and say, are we keeping up with the Joneses, but to see that, are any of us doing well if any of us are suffering? If children are dying anywhere in the world or suffering, can we really say that life is good? So, these are tools that, I don't think we've ever had access to in terms of shining that light and spreading information around the world. I guess I'll just say one more thing, which is that this year in 2023, there are 5.25 billion smartphones. That's up 4.9% over just last year, 2022. And from my mind, that's important because Joscha talked about the idea of, stable diffusion and other AI models that are not monolithic or centralized, centrally controlled, that can't as easily be used to divide and conquer and to separate us from ourselves. That gets really interesting when you think about, for the first time in humanity's history, we now have 5,000 satellites in the form of Starlink satellites dropping broadband, unlimited, unlimited, all you can eat broadband into any place on the planet. I have one on my car, so I can go camp in the middle of the Grand Canyon. And as long as I have a view of the sky, I can stay connected to people like you. So from my perspective, I guess I just say I'm optimistic. I believe that humanity is not nearly done. In fact, I'd say we're just getting started by looking at ourselves as a whole. So thank you.
Love it, Griffin. Love it. Thank you. Thank you. Tom, what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, so much is just feeding me right now. This conversation was incredibly rich, and I think my biggest takeaway from today is my relationship with this word, or these two words, artificial intelligence. And I have a realization that I've been looking through, I think as most of us are, this reductionist Descartes-driven mindset around this term artificial intelligence. And where I'm landing, coming from today's conversation in particular, is that this technology, this tool that's being developed, is in relation to our skull brain. And it's supportive of and augmenting our skull brain. But we're a mind. We're a conscious mind, not a skull brain. And so if I can hold this artificial intelligence in relation to augmenting my skull brain intelligence, then I can have a different relationship with AI than I did before the conversation today. And know that I and all of us our consciousness is in our mind, not our skull brain, and it's part of our collective consciousness, not just as the human species, not just here on Earth, but throughout the universe. And so I'm leaving today, and my relationship with this conversation this week is very different, and I'm immensely grateful for each of you in helping me with that journey. Thank you.
Yeah, beautifully put, Tom. Thank you. Georg, what's your concluding
Concluding thoughts. Well, I just also feel like this is a really potentiated moment with all the things we just spoken about. And I hope that this is the beginning of a longer project, a longer conversation. There seems to be, it feels as if something has woken up this year for many people. And I'm hoping that we can, together with Ubiquity University, Humanity Rising, and all the projects you guys are working on, converge and make the best out of this incredibly exciting moment to be alive. So I want to thank you all for your time. Everybody in the audience, the people in the chat, you guys have been amazing for 5 days. The undivided attention you get in the chat here is just incredible. And it really makes me hopeful that you guys are really out there, really putting yourself into this and keep a beginner's mind, even to the most complex subjects. So thank you all. Thank you, Joscha. Been great having you on the show. Thank you for your time. Thank you, Griffin. Thank you, Anna Lowe's. Tom, it was a pleasure to work with you, and Jim. As always, this wouldn't be possible without you. So thank you so much for this week, for the day, and I'm hoping this is the beginning of a beautiful, longer conversation and project. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all. And as we close, I just want to read the poem that Rita Marsh just put in the chat from Leonard Cohen, which I think is just a nice way to round out an extraordinary week. The birds, they sang at the break of day. Start again, I heard them say. Don't dwell on what has passed away or what is yet to be. Ah, the wars, they will be fought again. The holy dove, she will be caught again. Bought and sold and bought again. The dove is never free. Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. Thank you, everyone. Dwell on the light. It will lead. Bye for now.